Hey guys, it's Cynthia, and welcome back to my studio. I'm going to be doing another portrait study today, but this time I'm going to be using a reference photo that I've used before. And when I say before, I mean 2 days ago, because I already tried to record this video and accidentally lost about a third of the footage, so that's embarrassing, but there is value in retreading old ground, and doing things a second time can help you reapproach them from a different perspective. So I'm going to try it again, and hopefully we'll go somewhere good with it. All right, welcome back. It's time to do this study a second time. So I'm armed with my materials, which I'll post down in the description box for you. I've got my tinted gessoed hardboard panel. I've got my oil paint and using my palette that I usually use for studies, which I'll post up on the screen. And I'm using, for my medium, the earwax of the gods, otherwise known as Liquin. So as I mentioned in the introduction, trying this piece again, I was a bit put off going into it a second time, but now that I'm talking to you from the future, I can safely say that this both went easier and more successfully the second time. And that's awesome. No complaints here. I'm actually weirdly thankful that I got to start this over. Like in my last video, I talked a bit about how I like to do studies because they build a sort of muscle memory for future work. And this is a weird example of that exact thing happening in the wild. And I'll probably post a side-by-side shot of the first study and this one next to each other so that you can see a little bit where the differences are. For example, I definitely put the eye too close to the front of the face the first time. And even halfway through doing the study, I had to take a blending brush and sort of like move it around. It's like using the liquefy tool in Photoshop, but with traditional paint, which is hard. It's a lot less elegant. This is the dreaded under-chin shot that I've set out to do here. It's kind of a difficult angle on the model's face. And that was the whole purpose of doing this study. That was the lesson. Because when you can pull it off, the under-chin shot or the raised head can add like a lot of drama, can add heroism to a character or added strength. And it's just difficult because you don't have the usual landmarks on the face in the places you'd expect to find them. You have a lot of empty space in the cheek area between where like the ear and the features of the front of the face are. And when you're doing a front-on portrait or even a three-quarter portrait, you kind of already know where those things are going to go. You know that the eyes are going to be a certain distance apart, and you can measure from them to know where the nose is going to go and the lips. But here, everything's off kilter. Everything's a little bit tilted and moved around, and you don't have a hard shadow under the jaw that gives you a measuring point. So you just kind of have to pay more attention to the reference and feel it out as you go. So challenging, but definitely very fun. And I learned things from doing it the first time that then I could sleep on and sort of come back and approach it differently the next time that really ended up working out. So not only did my study go better the second time, but the tech failure kind of gave me a good idea of what I wanted to talk about today. I'm really enjoying doing these time-lapse chats, and you'll have to give me some feedback down in the comments section if you're digging these or if you want to hear more about what I'm actually working on the screen. But the topic that I decided to talk about today is starting over. So in a case like this where there was a malfunction of some kind, or if you're like a digital painter and you have a hard drive crash, or you're a traditional painter and you have a turpentine explosion, or something physical happens to your work, it's inevitable. You just have to start over. But there are also times when you can choose to. And so the core question is, when and why is it a good idea to choose to start a painting again? So I find it's best to start over anytime I identify that I have an unfixable problem. And that identification can come anytime during the process. Like, hopefully it's early. Hopefully you catch it soon so that you don't spend a lot of time invested in painting on something that's not going to go well. But most of the critical errors that can happen that will make or break your piece do happen early on, right at the beginning or even before you've made your first mark. So here are some examples of things that I've run into early on, and I'm sure this has happened to most of us at some point during an illustration. The first is I've laid a weak foundation to build on. And this is something like if I've mismeasured anatomy or if I've posed someone really wrong. There's no amount of paint you can put on top of a bad armature to save you. Another thing is, let's say I've got a weak composition. I've left too much about the whole of the image up to chance. That is why thumbnails are important. That's why sketches and thumbnails are considered a best practice. So you can get a roadmap ahead of time to know whether or not your placement of your subject and the value structure of your image and things like that are going to hold up at the final. Other times, it's that I have bad reference, like I shoot a lot of photos of my subjects beforehand that give me things like color information or value information or anatomy cues. And if I've rushed through that process or used bad lights or something, like that can screw me up later on because I don't have enough visual info to draw on. And I think the worst one of all, the last one, is starting from a weak concept. Now with studies, there's not really a concept behind a study. This is all about technical execution. It's about measurement and just kind of taking one little vignette of a subject and trying to execute on that as best as possible. But with an illustration, there's a lot more that goes into it and a lot more that has to be considered. I like to think of it as research and collecting information about my subjects and the goals of my illustration beforehand. Like, let's say I don't know who my characters are or why they're here. That is a huge problem that will come back to haunt me later on, and I'll end up with either something really boring or really confusing that doesn't do the job that it needs to do for the illustration. Things like where my characters came from right before I'm depicting them, or where they're going after. Those things are critical. So an exercise you can do is take your last illustration or your last piece of art that you did and really critically look at it and ask yourself, would this have gone better if I had spent more time with the sketch or got better reference or planned out my composition more, or, even the concept, was my concept good? Asking myself those questions after some of my old illustrations has led me to refining that process a little bit better over time. The upshot of most of these things happening early is that you can learn to correct for them earlier and earlier as you make more paintings, or learn to not even start something until you've got all of these questions figured out. And over time, as I've worked, I've become more vigilant and figured out how to build all of these things into my process. Now, sometimes that doesn't help if you don't notice early on and you've invested a ton of time into something already. It might be tempting to just try to keep going and push through it to the final. And that's okay some of the time. I mean, especially when you're just starting out or when you're learning or when it's not for a client and you just want to see how far you can go with a piece. I'm not going to tell you that's bad. But when you have a deadline, let's say, that problem is compounded because the more time you spend going down a bad road that's not going to make a successful final, the less time you have to course correct. Now, speaking of time investment, there is another thing that I've run into kind of often, and that's over-rendering. And so this is usually what happens when I've been working on something for way too long, like it's hour 14 or 15 and I've had way too much coffee and I'm just zoomed in on something and not really paying attention to the whole illustration anymore. I'm just noodling away and scribbling on something that I don't need to be working on anymore. I will tell you that this is one of the reasons that I love digital illustration, because if this happens to me during a digital piece, I can just go back to the last save. I don't have to start all the way over. But with a traditional painting, I really have to watch myself that I don't go down that road, because if something goes wrong at the end, it is so much more painful to have to start over all the way from the beginning. And there are ways that I can just destroy the foundation that I've laid for a painting, even if it's a really good foundation. If I've just painted way too much over the whole thing, I am filled with regret. And to avoid that, I do like to try to check in with the painting every so often and take breaks, take steps back, sleep on it for a night. It's a good habit to get into so that you don't run into that problem. So now that we've talked a little bit about starting over because of unfixable problems on things that we're working on right now, I want to shift it around a little bit and talk about artistic growth and starting over through the lens of measuring our own progress. Now, there's a meme that's been going around for a long time, kind of a level up exercise where people will take things they did a few years ago or at the beginning of their career and then revisit those same ideas with their improved skill sets. And I think these things are great. I think that that's an incredibly self-respectful measure of one's own progress. And it's really great sometimes to be able to just look at a side-by-side comparison of where we've been and where we are now, because it lets us imagine where we can go from there. And it shows us that we've gotten better with time, and there's so much value to that, because we get so bogged down sometimes, I think, in comparing ourselves to other artists rather than our own selves. There's a saying that I really like, and that is, comparison is the thief of joy. And that's true when we're comparing ourselves to our heroes, because it's really not fair. It's really not fair to us. The better version of that is to compare ourselves to ourselves. I think it might actually be fun to do a video at some point where I go back to some of my old work and try to improve on it. There are so many pieces from my past that I would absolutely cringe to show off on here. There are just so many things that were bad from the concept. But there are other pieces that I really liked the idea, or there was some kind of kernel of goodness in there somewhere, and it was just a bad technical execution, and that's probably the one that I would lean on. One. I say it like there's just one. That's funny. But to wrap this up, I hope that no one ever feels ashamed of having to start over when it's the right thing to do. And if it's not your choice and something exploded and you had to start over, hang in there, because it might be better the next time. So before I go, I just wanted to say thank you again to my viewers and to my subscribers. Please subscribe if you haven't already for updates, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.